Right now, I'll be honest with you, Pastor Wellington really took a lot of my thunder because he did a lot in sharing some things that I really want to focus on. And for communicators, especially for communication directors, pastors, this presentation is really for you in order for us to sort of recalibrate our ideologies as to what we need to do in all things for communications. And so for us, we just want to have a streamlined understanding. There's a question, and I posed this question when I did a brief training for the Western New York family. The question I give for all of my communicators today is the question that Jesus gave to his disciples when they were walking in the town of Caesarea Philippi. He turned to them and he said, "Whom do they say that the Son of Man is? Whom do they say I am?" As communicators, as pastors, as church leaders, as ones who are concerned about the message that your church presents, I think it's an honest question to ask. How would your congregation describe your church? What would your members say about your church? What is the narrative that goes about your church? What are the things that people are positively and or negatively saying about your church? Don't let me just speak this over your head. I want you to answer this question in your mind. What would your church members, what are your church members saying positively and negatively about your church? And the reason why I asked you to answer this question is because as communicators, it is important for you to recognize that you are in charge of the message that comes across about your church. You are in charge of the sense or the reputation that you're trying to build in regards to your church. You are the communicator. And more than anything else, our job as a communicator is to constantly have our ear to the ground as to what not only our congregation thinks, but what do your guests think? What do your neighbors that are across the street from your church, they're on the sides of your church, think about your church? What does your local leadership think about your church? What is the random lady at the local grocery store? What do they think about your church? It's important to answer these questions because a lot of times as communicators, a lot of times as leaders, we have a failed understanding of thinking we truly understand what people think about our church, what message we are trying to actually get across. It is important for us as communicators to know we are responsible for the answers of these said questions. We are responsible for the answers of how people think or feel about our church. Now, it may not necessarily be in direct correlation to what we have done or haven't done, but it's important for us as we strategize to begin to start to hear some things that are happening on the ground of what people think about our church. What they think about your church moving forward. That local lady in the grocery store, when they talk about your church, are they excited about it? What are they saying about it? Reason why is because I want to address the elephant in the room. And this comment is not meant to offend. But I think it's important as communicators for us to be the first ones that are honest. And the reality of what we're dealing with, family, is we're dealing with the reality of us ministering in the Northeast area of the United States. And let's just be honest about it. Let's just tell the truth. Majority of our churches, might be different in, you know, the DMV area, or in California, or in Texas, or even in Alabama. But in the Northeast area, most of our churches, most of the Northeastern Conference churches are Caribbean based. Can we agree on that? And if we recognize that, we might recognize that our messaging, our approach towards ministry might have a particular bias. Bias is not negative. It's not necessarily looked to have a negative of sense, but it's important for us to recognize that we are skewed to think certain ways, like everybody else is skewed to see certain things certain ways, depending on where they came from, depending on who they are. Okay, and so because we have been sort of skewed to see certain things in a certain way based on our background, based on where in which we've come from, we must also accept how that type of bias might shape the way we communicate, how much we shape the message and or even the brand of our churches. So let's just be honest here. My parents are from Haiti. I am a proud Haitian American, and I understand that as my parents are not necessarily from this country, I myself was born here in this country. And I remember growing up when there was Thanksgiving time, and I remember having my aunts and uncles over for Thanksgiving and hearing conversation between my parents and their siblings. I often used to hear them talk about everything that used to happen back home. This is happening back home, and the president is doing things back home, and everything is either positive or negative back home. And it gave me a cause to pause here, because I began to start to ask myself the question of saying, well, if Haiti is home, then what is this? If back home is home, then how do you see where you live now? And it took a little time for me to begin to start to realize that a lot of times people who have moved from different places and to come to where they are now have used this country relatively as a means to an end, as a way to better either themselves or to better their families. And understand where I'm going here, because if your mentality of looking at the place in which you are occupying as a means to an end, you may not necessarily be looking to benefit the community. You might be looking to allow the community to benefit your circumstances. Okay, so I've come here to get a better job. I've come here to supply a better resources for my children, that if I don't necessarily make it, quote unquote, at least my children will make it. But if we have that mentality in life, could we then realize that might skew the way in which we do church? Could we then agree to recognize that ideology might have warped the way in which we've approached ministry in the Northeast? And the reason why I say this is because the average church in Northeastern Conference has come to wherever they've come to, purchased a particular church building because it was either affordable or it was passed down, or whatever the history of the church is. They've come to the church to worship. They worship in the style that they best recognize, and then when they're done worshiping, they return back to their homes. Think about this. There might not necessarily have been a strategy of what community you want to worship in. You may not necessarily have said, okay, I want to target this particular community as a place for us to find a building. Most times we just found a building because it was advantageous to us. We were a couple of families that just wanted to start a church. And so we came together, we found a particular property, we set up shop. We came to minister and worship our way. And then when we returned back home. And unfortunately, when we have that particular skew, we might limit the impact that we have on the community and ultimately everyone else that is looking towards our church to be effective in the community that we're in. They might be, the reputation of your church might not necessarily be a church that provides for the community and does things that are beneficial for the families that represent that community, but it's just the church that takes up my parking on Saturdays when they come into worship. And it's important as communicators for us to recognize that, because again, as the communicator, it's our job to shape and to reshape the message of our church. Let's just address the elephant in the room. Many of us are worshiping and are leading in churches that are not really doing much for our communities outside of a relative soup kitchen. I'm not poo-pooing the soup kitchen, it's important. But our sentiment may not necessarily be geared towards making a relative impact necessary than just catering to our own particular needs. How do we change that narrative? How do we as communicators, what is our responsibility towards our church, and what message do we send to the people who are watching our church? I want to give you a quote by Steve Jobs, a very famous quote that where he says, "You've got to start with the customer experience and work back towards the technology and not the other way around." You can't think that I need to get the technology, like Dr. Wellington mentioned, get all the equipment first without first understanding who am I communicating to? Why am I communicating to it? How are those people best reached? It's important for the communication director, stay with me, communication directors. This is your job to not just handle with the technical aspects. You are not called just to be the hands-on tech support.
Comes to your email saying
your job, your responsibility as communicators is to be the ones that communicates to church leaders. You're the one that speaks to your pastor and makes sure that your pastor understands there needs to be a strategy. As the communication director for the Northeastern Conference, let me say, I am in my president's ear every day. There isn't a day that I don't have a relative conversation with Dr. Abraham Jules. And what I appreciate about my president is there isn't anything that he does communication-wise in regards to messaging where he doesn't come and see me first. There needs to be a constant communication between the leadership of the church and the communicator of the church. It is your responsibility. And we can't, as communicators anymore, blame other people for the reason why things didn't look the way they look. Oh, they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have the adequate camera. They didn't know what to say. The reality is, you're right. They didn't know what to say. They didn't have the adequate camera. They didn't know how to position themselves because they're not the communicator. And so they're leaning towards us to be responsible to say, that doesn't look good. It's important for you to be the truth that your church needs. Come on, say amen. You need to be the truth that your church needs to hear. And so what's our strategy here? What's the customer experience? Who exactly are we reaching? I'd like to pause here and interject something that I think is extremely profound, in the sense where I mentioned this before. I want to say this again on this particular platform. If the church is meant to be a hospital, then understand here, family, that not every hospital is called to be a general hospital. Let me say that again. Just because your church is seen as a hospital doesn't mean that every hospital is called to be a general hospital. And the reason is because some of us don't have the equipment. Some of us don't have the resources. Some of us don't have the calling to minister in a bunch of areas that we're not necessarily called to be. And the reason why a lot of times the message of our church is so poorly received is because we're living outside of our means. We're doing things we might not necessarily been called to do. I appreciate today our class at 2:15 of Church Production Simplified, because the reality is everybody might want to do a full-on broadcast production of their church, but not everybody's called to do that. And not everybody needs to do that in order for them to be effective in what they do. Sometimes simple is better. A lot of times we feel like because we have a church manual and we have all these X departments and we feel like we need to do all of these departments. You know what? The thing that is failing in church is that we're doing so many things poorly rather than doing a few things effectively. I'd rather discontinue 20 things that I'm doing poorly and do 3 things that I do well. You can allow your resources for those people who are saying, oh man, we don't have the money to properly communicate. You know the reason why? It's because we're spreading our resources too thin. You know what? Let's figure out what the consumer needs. Let's see what the customer needs, for lack of a better term. Let's see what our community is calling for. And then reshape how we communicate to that community by discontinuing to allow our resources to become more stronger, to have a more positive impact on how we communicate. So this way, your church is not known for the church that takes up parking. You're the church that does daycare extremely well. You're the church that does effective senior citizen ministry extremely well. That we don't do men's ministry or anything or something like that. But you know what? We do a great paint night for our seniors. Try to find a way to be targeted in what you do, so that when you're able to communicate, you know what you're marketing. When you communicate, you can be intentional about how in which you target a set audience. Determine your reason, family. Determine your reason for being. Communicators, determine your reason for why you are in the community that you're in. Why did God place you on the block that you're on? When we can determine what and why we are in the place that we're in, we can effectively change the world in our local community. And communicators, it is your job to change the paradigm, to suggest these things to your leaders. We have to be the creative brains. We have to be the ones to show our leaders, to show our pastors, to show our elders things that they might not have seen before. I don't fault any pastor or any church leader that is quote unquote stuck in the past. The reason is because in their past, the methodology that they've used worked. And so because they've used something that worked, they're going to continue to keep using it because that's all they know. I want to shout out one of my assistant directors, Gary Saunders, who in a conversation we had, he told me, he reminded me, he said, listen, we got to help them be the best versions of themselves. We got to help them. We got to give them the materials and the tools that they may not know. Your pastor might come and suggest, oh, you know what? I want to do a program and I want to do it on Zoom. Don't let your pastor dictate the platform by which you have to do what you have to do. You're the communicator. You suggest to your pastor, yeah, no, pastor, there's a better thing that we can use. I suggest that we use, in this particular situation, we can use this platform or we can use that platform. Maybe instead of Zoom all the time, let's use Google Meet. because Google Meet might be a little bit easier. Let's use Microsoft Teams instead of Slack. It's your job to give the leaders the options that they can use to make a better decision. The cost-effective ways to make a better decision. Determine your reason for why you do what you do so that you can better and more efficiently choose what is necessary. Communicators, you are in charge of your stage. You are in charge of the stage. Don't let anything fool you. You are in charge of the stage. Don't get me wrong, your pastor, your elders, they're in charge of the content. You're in charge of how it looks. Do not blame anybody else for how things look. The buck stops with you on how it looks. You're in charge of your staging. Whether your staging is online, whether your stage is virtual, whether your stage is in person, you are in charge of your stage. And so provide the help, provide the guidance, provide the resources. Be the ones to call people into a meeting to do some tech support. Call somebody in an hour before worship service and make sure that the cameras are on and everyone is in a good position. I want to see you. I want to hear you, Sister so-and-so, and what you're doing. When your pastor might suggest, no, you know what? I want to have everybody come up and say a random testimony. This is where you interject and say, Pastor, especially on an online situation, I don't know if that might be best because I don't necessarily know what that person is going to look like. And you control what is put out there. You have no problem with, question was placed on the chat, if your pastor chooses who's on the platform. I have no problem if your pastor chooses who's on the platform, just as long as they meet me an hour before so I can make them look good. I have no problem with you choosing whoever you got to do. I have a problem with that random thing where in the middle of service, let's break out into, testimonies. Whoa, I don't know, whoa. Especially on a virtual sense, in the church, it might be a little bit better for us to do that. On a virtual sense, I don't know if anybody want to just turn on their camera randomly and just show themselves to the world. I may not necessarily be the best thing for you. You have to be in your pastor's ear. Your pastor, as Dr. Wellington mentioned in our first presentation, your pastor does not want to look bad. Trust me, she doesn't want to look bad. And so they need that advice. Sometimes, I'm with Dr. Jules and I got to remind him, you got to look directly into the camera. You need to sometimes do those things. You need to sometimes hold your pastor's hand in order for them to be the best versions of themselves. This is your responsibility. You are responsible for the stage. You're responsible for the lighting of your stage. Whether it's virtual, whether it's online, whether it's in person, you are in charge for how the lighting is. And we know as communicators, we know how important lighting is. It is no coincidence why the first thing God created was light. Lighting is extremely important, family. Lighting is extremely important. We understand that psychologically, if a person can't see well, if they can't see visually what they're trying to engage with, they disconnect. I'll share with you a story when I was installed in a church. I remember the installation day, I was walking down the main aisle as the procession was leading up to the rostrum. And all I was doing was looking at the chandeliers. And I was looking at the chandeliers and I was comparing the chandelier lights to the house lights that were on in the ceiling. And I turned to the first elder while we were on stage and I said, do you see something with the lights? And he says, no, Pastor, I don't see. What do you see? I said, the chandelier lights are daylight lights, and the house lights are soft white. Why are there two different styles of lights? Don't you notice that one looks really bright and white, and the other one's really soft and it almost feels warm? Why are the two lights different? And he looked at it and he said, well, I've never noticed it before. I said, well, you'll be surprised how many people don't recognize that, but it's a deterrent to their eyes. So I said, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna change all the light bulbs this week, and we're gonna make them all uniform. And we did that. We didn't do a single thing to the church. All we did was made sure that the entire lighting in the church, in the sanctuary, pardon me, in the sanctuary was daylight lights, bulbs. And the next Sabbath, when the brethren came into the church, everyone looked around like we did some renovation. Nobody could understand what changed, but everyone was saying something changed. It's important for us to notice these small things. You're the communicator, and we communicate visually. We communicate through what we listen to. So you're responsible for the sound. You're responsible for the sound. You are responsible for how things sound. If it's important for us to train and get our own audio engineer for certain things, it is our priority, because we are in charge of how things sound. We are in charge of the levels of how things sound. We're in charge of what is displayed on our projection screens, on our TV monitors, on our online and virtual platforms. We are in charge of what is displayed. There should not, as a communicator, as a communication director, there should be nothing that is sent out that does not have your stamp of approval. As a communication director, I do not like anything being sent out from a conference platform that I haven't seen it okay. Because the buck stops with me. The buck stops with me. And so for every department that works in your church, that wants to do a particular program, they need to come to you. You need to be a part of that discussion. You need to let them know things that will work and things that won't work. They can't have a conversation, plan out everything that they want to do, and then come to you and say, this is what we're going to do, make it work. No, sir. No, ma'am. That's not how it works. No, we need to be involved in the conversation so we can let you know ways that it can actually be improved, things that can be better, easier methodologies of how to get things done. You need to be at the table. You need to set the guidelines and the grounds for certain things to happen on certain platforms. It's your responsibility. What is seen, what is heard, what is shown. To develop a plan on that, develop a guideline on what to do, on what not to do, on what to see and what not to see. Have a conversation with your pastor one of those random days and sit down and say, let's have a discussion on protocol of what we want to see and what we don't want to see. It's a necessary conversation to have. I was a proud pastor of the Shalom Church in in the Bronx, when I was a pastor in the Greater New York Conference. And this was their stage before I became the pastor there. My good friend Mike O, who's there doing what I would only assume would be some spoken word, because that's what he does. And notice the stage here. Now, beautiful chairs. None of the chairs are ripped up, you know. But I just want to notice a couple of things. First thing I want to notice is I got a random microphone and a microphone stand that's just there. Why is it there? Who knows? It's important for you to have a person on the floor that's able to remove things that might be an eyesore and are irrelevant. It is your responsibility as the communicator to be in charge of what is seen. I got a whole bunch of chairs on this stage. It would suggest that at some point in time, there are people who are sitting in those chairs. Okay, well, if people are sitting in those chairs, how do I best control what I can only count to be, 11 chairs maybe on this stage? How do I control to make sure that those 11 people are doing things that are adequate on the stage, whether it is being broadcast or not? How do I know that somebody isn't randomly picking their nose or what have you? That's the reason why you find nowadays churches have moved towards clearing the stage. It's not necessarily for the sake of clearing the stage or to be worldly, but as we begin to start to evolve, we begin to start to realize it's hard for us to police, for lack of a better term, how many people are on the stage when they're all on stage. And the more people on stage, the more things that people have a choice to look at. And as the communicator, your job is to get the message across. So that's probably the reason as to why the simplicity of your stage might be better, because it removes distractions. Right? You have a random stand for your musical notes. That's on the left. You have two hymnals that are displayed on the chair for what would only conclude to be, we want to show that we are an Adventist church that shows our hymnal. I don't know what the message behind that, but okay. And then we have a sign in the back. We have a banner in the back. Good choice, bad choice. Make a choice. Well, that's a good message for us as communicators to choose what's the good choice and what's the bad choice. Do you believe that banner is adequate enough for you to display as the main focus, the main graphic for your church? Is it at a quality that you would want to highlight and focus as the brand for your church? Because it's dead center. It's up for you to decide, but it's important for you to make those conversations a part of your responsibility. This is the stage before I got there. This is the stage after I got there. Family, it's the same stage. Same stage. And family, I did no renovations. Not one. All I did was clear the stage. I got a more intentional pulpit. And all I did was get some nice portable backdrops that are literally stackable, LED lights so you can change the mood. Pray for our plants. We're struggling. We're struggling with those plants. But now Rachel, my young person Rachel, is singing with pride. And family, it's the same stage. It's not about how much money you have. It's about the intention that you want to have. Quick little resource. Those backdrops, those backdrops that I have are custom. Go to portablebackdrops.com, portablebackdrops.com, and you will get them. I purchased them from portablebackdrops.com. Look it up, portablebackdrops.com. I'm going to ask one of my technicians to put that website there, portablebackdrops.com. And you can easily order it. It's so easy. Extremely easy. No renovation, family, nothing. All you did was you want to make it a little bit more modern. You want to make it a little bit more clean. You are in charge of what is shown. Be intentional. Sit with your team and answer these questions. Your job isn't to sit and say, okay, what do we have to do to get through this Sabbath? Your job is, how do we make our church move forward? You are in charge of what goes out on the internet. You are in charge of the message that comes out on the internet. That is your responsibility, communicators. Question. Right now, I want everybody to, if hopefully you're not on your phones. If you are, it's all right. You can pass by. I want everybody to grab your phones, and I want you to do a Google search. Go on Google right now, and I want you to search for your church. I'll give everybody a couple of seconds. Right now, go on your phone. Right now, go on your phone. Switch off, if you're on your phone right now, switch off of Zoom really quickly, minimize Zoom real quick, and go on to Google and just type in your church's name and see what pops up. Now, whatever pops up, what you want to do is you want to focus on a couple of things. The first thing you want to focus on is, what's the first, second, and third website in that search that popped up? Does Google have an adequate representation of your current information? Does it have your website? And is your website accurate? Is your phone number accurate? There might be photos that Google has of your church. Are those photos up to date? Are those photos accurate? Are those photos something you would want to represent your church? You are the communicator. And what's so easy about Google is you can literally determine what is seen on a Google search. They don't even police it. And odds are, even before YouTube, the first thing people do when they search for your church is go to a search engine to find your church. So if I'm looking for your church, I'm going to a search engine. If you're the communicator, the first thing that you want to do is possibly figure out what people are looking at. And you want to make sure that your church is easily recognizable. Easily recognizable. There's a comment in the chat about the portable backdrop. I apologize. It's portablebackdroppanels.com. My apologies. Portable backdrop panels with an S.com. That's the website. Portable backdrop panels. Backdrop singular. Backdrop panels with an S. You're welcome. Make sure that you have an adequate representation of what your visitors will see when they search for your church. Does your church have social media accounts? Thank you, Chi, very much. Does your church have adequate social media accounts? What's your online experience? All those things are important. And you'll get a lot more of those details as we go into our breakout. Number 3, you are responsible for the brand of your church. You are in charge of the logo. You are in charge of the color scheme. You are in charge of the fonts. You are in charge of the graphics. You may not necessarily be a graphic designer, that's fine. And you go find an account on Fiverr. Go find an opportunity. We have a class on church branding. Have that opportunity. Make sure you recognize color, your concept. Make sure you take photos of everything in your church. Make sure you're aware of the fonts. You are responsible for your church. Finally, and one of the more important things, you are in charge of the messaging of your church. If there's a quote, if there's a letter, if there is any news that comes from your church, you are in charge of making sure you are a part of that discussion. If there's any PR, if there's any scandal at your church, as the communication director, you are responsible for hearing, for seeing what is being said from your church. Know and recognize as responsible as we are to getting the technical things done, it is also very important for us to recognize that we ourselves are the champions for the cause of the messaging of our church. Take heed and control, as was mentioned in the chat, control the narrative. It is your responsibility. It's our presentation for today.